Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Shona. It is absolutely delightful to be back in New Zealand for the first time in 2.5 years. A much longer break than I ever expected when I flew out in December 2019. Fantastic to see everyone here today, and hello to everyone online. To begin, Auckland has been a major railway terminus since the 1870s. Its electric commuter trains carry upwards of 20 million people a year, while freight trains carry thousands of tonnes weekly. But what if you want to catch a long-distance passenger train? Well, Te Huia runs to Hamilton twice on weekdays, while in September, the thrice-weekly Northern Explorer to Wellington will resume after an extended hiatus. This attenuated offering falls well short of rail services in comparable countries. Now, Wellington has similar suburban rail to Auckland, but elsewhere in New Zealand, passenger rail is conspicuous by its absence. Today, I want to discuss why this happened, what the passenger rail network used to look like, and the reasons for its contraction. Its decline was not inevitable. It occurred because of deliberate policy and poor choices. I will then reflect on what this means for the future of passenger rail. So in December last year, as Shona mentioned, I published a book with mapmaker Sam van der Veerden, Can't Get There From Here, New Zealand Passenger Rail Since 1920. And as I mentioned, this is the first time I've been able to visit New Zealand since publication. Besides COVID disrupting the best laid plans, I also moved to Perth to take up my role at Curtin in February. So COVID and transcontinental moves are somewhat disruptive. I'm originally from Ramadi Beach on the Kapiti Coast, and my research reflects my trans-Tasman experience. I'm also working at the moment on an environmental history of railways in colonial Australia and New Zealand. But in terms of the book at hand, I'm delighted to finally be able to talk about it in New Zealand, and my slides today contain some of Sam's maps, as well as some pictures, mostly ones that actually missed the cut from the book. So here's a bit of a special treat of things that I wish I could have squeezed in. So let's have a look. Oh. All good. All right, so good timing because there we go. We've got this bit of an animation going on here that you can see gradually passenger services disappearing. I don't know how well those of you up the back can see it, but you probably get the general impression that 1920s, some lines are opening, and then later on, let's see. Is it still doing the thing? Oh, no, all good. And as you can see, it then just whoomp, disappears. So it's a rather stark contraction over the course of a century. And when I began researching the book, what I wanted to know was not just when each line first opened or when its last service ran. What I wanted to know was why this happened. So I will clarify just quickly some terminology for those of you who are not immersed in railway history. From the 1870s to 1982, almost every railway in New Zealand was operated by the government's Railways Department, usually known as NZR. In 1982, it became the New Zealand Railways Corporation, ahead of privatisation in 1993. Now, we had a rather unhappy experience of privatisation, so the network is now back in public hands as KiwiRail. Passenger trains have ranged over the course of the past century from what were known as limited expresses, so named for their limited number of stops, they were the fastest trains, right down to with car goods and mixed trains. What these were rural services that carry passengers and goods and were really slow. Much of the network was built by the Public Works Department, and in the late 1940s, the PWD became known as the Ministry of Works. So let's wind the clock back a bit. The railway networks emanating from Wellington and Auckland were not connected until 1908 with the completion of the North Island Main Trunk Railway. Heading northwards from Auckland, the North Auckland Line in 1920 had not yet reached Whangarei. Travellers from Auckland could get little further than Wellsford, while two isolated lines catered for Northlanders. One ran from Whangarei to Kaikoui and the Bay of Islands, while the other ran north from Dargaville towards the Great Waipawa Kauri Forest. The first express train from Auckland to Whangarei finally ran in 1923. There were also major works underway in Auckland at the time. The steep original route of the North Island Main Trunk via Newmarket was at capacity. It was bypassed with the much flatter Westfield deviation in 1930, which most of you probably know today as the Eastern Line. Now, the Eastern Line opened at the same time, and I hope you're enjoying my increasingly wacky slide transitions. It opened at the same time as Auckland received a brand new railway station on Beach Road to replace a crowded terminus at the bottom of Queen Street. When it opened, it was bustling. Express trains ran to the Bay of Islands, Wellington, Rotorua, Tauranga, and from 1933, New Plymouth. Auckland's suburban network was busy. There were plans to electrify it and to balance the Westfield deviation with what was known as the Morningside deviation, a tunnel under the central city along roughly the same route as the City Rail link currently under construction today. The Beach Road railway station was remote from the city centre, but this wasn't seen as a problem at the time. After all, the Morningside deviation was expected to provide city access, and if it had, it would probably have been a thriving interchange between long-distance services and suburban trains. Moreover, Auckland had a dense tram network for the city and inner suburbs, which provided speedy connections from the railway station to the central city along Queen Street and other major arteries. Auckland was a rail and tram city, and it stayed that way for decades after the motorcar became commonplace. In 1955, 58% of motorised journeys in Auckland were taken by public transport. Why did this change? So, in the late 1920s, the future looked good for NZR. Major railway construction projects were underway nationwide, and prominent express trains were being upgraded. In May 1930, the Rotorua Express evolved into New Zealand's premier passenger train, the Rotorua Limited. Equipped with brand new carriages, including the first observation car in New Zealand, it completed the journey from Auckland to Rotorua in 6 hours. But the timing of its introduction was unfortunate. It began as the effects of the Great Depression began to seriously bite. Malcolm McKinnon, in his History of the Depression in New Zealand, describes NZR as the fly in the ointment of the national accounts. It lost over £1.2 million in the year to the 31st of March 1930, and railway construction comprised almost half the National Public Works budget. So, Royal Commission in 1930 advised cancelling many services and construction projects to save money. These included an extension of the East Coast Main Trunk from the Bay of Plenty via Gisborne to Hawke's Bay, cancellation of a line from Rotorua to Taupo, the next stage of the North Auckland line towards Kaitaia, the main North line from North Canterbury to Marlborough, Nelson's long-desired connection to the national network, and a line through the Buller Gorge to Westport. In fact, so significant were these cuts that work even ceased on linking Dargaville's isolated railway to the North Auckland line, despite construction being literally within sight of the town. Rail came to comprise less than a fifth of the public works budget, and it has never regained a leading position in New Zealand public works investment. When Michael Joseph Savage led the Labour Party to a landslide victory in 1935, his ministry authorised work to resume on some, but not all, of the proposed projects. Gisborne and Dargaville were in the end linked to the North Island network, and Marlborough and Buller to the South Island one. But Savage's government sealed Nelson's fate. Its isolated railway was never connected to the wider network. And the delay in Dargaville meant that decision makers decided for a new railway alignment. Instead of building the line into the centre of town, they constructed a new terminus on the town's fringe that suited industry, but was inconvenient for passengers. They believed it was more modern to locate railways outside of towns. The same rationale underpinned similar decisions, such as relocating Palmerston North's railway station to the industrial outskirts. Now, this was, as you can see from the photo in top right here, partly because steam locomotives were a dirty and noisy presence. But it was also clear that cleaner, quieter forms of propulsion were going to replace steam. The real reason that these lines and stations were more modern was because NZR was prioritising goods over passengers. So, move on now to World War II, which had serious consequences for NZR. Petrol and tyre shortages meant that the railways were busier than ever. And at the end of the war, NZR was run down and understaffed. Too few people had been expected to do too much with too little during wartime. Moreover, coal shortages since January 1944 meant timetables had been cut drastically, and these coal shortages continued for years after the end of the war. NZR cancelled rural mixed trains, which it saw as slow and unviable, and often not unreasonably so. But despite this parlous post-war condition, NZR's intercity trunk routes were viable, and it had considerable potential in suburban areas. So NZR began planning for revitalisation. Wellington was first beneficiary. The Johnsonville and Paikakariki lines had been electrified in the late 1930s to overcome their steep grades and long tunnels, so this provided a firm base for a modern new railway through the Hutt Valley to serve state housing and industrial developments. By 1955, not only was Wellington's entire suburban network electrified, but an 8-kilometre tunnel had been driven under the Rimataka Range. Now, even more extensive proposals were made for Auckland, and these are depicted here. NZR and the Ministry of Work set out their vision for the future, and esteemed British civil engineers William Helcrow and J.P. Thomas submitted a report endorsing an ambitious network. So the aforementioned Morningside deviation under the central city was the centrepiece of all of these proposals. And the Helcrow-Thomas report provided a blueprint for the next half century. Essentially, this map is what Auckland could have had in the year 2000 if the plans of the late 1940s had been acted upon. Helcrow and Thomas, moreover, were not the only international experts who endorsed major railway investment. British electrification experts Charles Mertz and William McClellan proposed electrification of Auckland's railways in 1925, and their recommendation to spark Wellington's commuter network and Christchurch to Lyttelton had been acted on. Peter Fraser's Labour government in the 1940s supported NZR General Manager Frank Aiken to study electrification overseas. And when he returned, Sydney Holland's national government had come to power, and they received favourably Aiken's conclusion that the entire main trunk from Auckland to Wellington needed to be electrified. Swedish experts visited New Zealand in 1950 to confirm Aiken's judgment, and Holland's cabinet endorsed the first stage from Auckland to Hamilton in 1950. Now, hop on to Huia to Hamilton, and you're going to quickly notice a problem here. The train is pulled by diesel locomotives, and there are no electric wires between Papakura and Hamilton. What happened? Well, Aiken resigned in 1951, having struggled to work with some other senior NZR officials and the Holland ministry. And a 1952 Royal Commission on Railways found the internal conflict disturbing. Aiken's successor, Horace Lusty, cancelled electrification in favour of replacing steam locomotion with diesels. This was a mistake. Lusty slandered Aiken as being under an undefined, quote, influence from outside. But if Aiken's plan had been followed, Auckland would have had electric suburban trains 60 years earlier. And we still, to this day, do not have a fully electrified North Island main trunk all the way Auckland to Wellington. And so while all of this played out, New Zealand's passenger trains were declining in quality. The coal shortages meant many regional expresses ran only thrice weekly rather than daily, and the protracted lockout of waterfront workers in 1951 meant some routes ran only twice a week. Even after the waterfront dispute ended and coal distribution returned to normal levels, these services were not restored to daily timetables. Other trains were suspended for the entirety of the lockout and simply never returned. Daily commuter trains between Christchurch and Little River and Southbridge, for instance, never came back. Stan Gooseman held most infrastructure portfolios in the Holland National Government. And when a journalist asked him in 1953 why the new Southern Motorway in Auckland did not have a reservation for a railway or a tramway, he replied condescendingly, "My boy, the future of Auckland is with the motor car." So we went from a vision for rail very abruptly to a vision for road. But for those services that survived, NZR was looking to a new solution, rail cars. It is hard to comprehend today the excitement and emotions attached to rail cars from the early 20th century through to the 1970s. They are essentially a self-driving passenger carriage. Rail cars can be much more economical than a locomotive-hauled carriage train. They promise greater mobility to rural communities and intercity travellers alike. And people followed the progress of NZR's experiments closely. It was difficult to import foreign technology. Railcars that worked on Britain's well-built, gentle railways struggled on our twisting, cheaply built lines. In 1936, NZR was finally able to unveil its first fleet of successful mainline railcars, the Wairarapa class over here at left on the slide, designed for the rigours of crossing the Remataka Range that separates the Hutt Valley and the Wairarapa. There was no tunnel in those days. Instead, it was a steep mountain railway, the Remataka Incline. Now, to give you an idea of how thrilling its introduction was, here is how Wellington writer Oliver Gillespie described the new railcar. Now vanishes that old bogie, the mixed train. Now enters the ferry, the new magic vehicle, the railcar. Next came the standard class at right here in 1938, which operated premier routes in the North Island. These were such a hit that police had to control the crowds of thousands who came to view the first services to Whanganui and New Plymouth. Now, unable to build enough railcars locally, NZR also imported the Vulcan class from Britain in 1940 for use in the South Island. And all of these confirmed a policy to design a general purpose railcar for long distance services. And after World War II, an order was placed for 35, which was expected to be expanded to a fleet of at least 50 and probably more. These railcars are known by many names. Twin sets or twin units for their articulated design, 88-seaters for their capacity, Drurys for their British manufacturer, or Fiats for their Italian motors. I call them Fiats, and you're soon going to see why. NZR has received many requests for railcar services, and these maps that are on screen, and which are also in the book, they depict the routes considered in 1951. But unfortunately, delays plagued construction. NZR kept changing its mind about what exactly it wanted. Frank Aiken had approved the order in January 1950, but for example, Horace Lusty insisted in November 1951 that the railcars have reclining seats, which necessitated redesigning the railcar bodies to fit the seats. This meant that Drury decided to prioritise other orders while New Zealand made up its mind about exactly what it wanted the design to be. And so, although the railcars were meant to be delivered from 1952, the first ones didn't arrive until early 1955. Almost immediately, the Fiat motors proved defective, carbon accumulated in the exhaust and sparked line-side fires, crankcases broke, and a litany of other defects occurred. NZR's engineers concluded that the motors had to be rebuilt. Italian mechanics flew in to rebuild the motors, and it was not until October 1958 that NZR had 35 railcars in good working order. There's one of them now. So despite these problems, the Fiat railcars were a hit. For the previous couple of decades, many of NZR's senior officials had insisted that the existing patronage represented the fullness of the market and that new customers could not be enticed. Yet from the moment the Fiats began operating, patronage surged 25 to 30% on every route. Or in the case of the Wairarapa, where their introduction coincided with the opening of the Remataka Tunnel, it ballooned by 115%. Auckland got its first taste in November 1956, when Fiats took over the services to Northland and Taranaki. They followed in February 1959 by replacing the almost moribund twice-weekly expresses from Auckland to Rotorua and Taneatua. Passengers had been voting with their feet. If you want an idea of how far the Rotorua Express had fallen, Rotorua Station, in its heyday in 1929, sold over 35,000 tickets, while in 1958, it sold under 6,500. So the Fiats commenced a daily and quicker timetable on both routes and saw an immediate surge in ridership again. Funnily enough, people prefer a quick daily service over a slow twice-weekly one. Who could have known? Apparently, NZR's senior managers didn't think this was possible until the Fiat showed up. Now, for most travellers, these new services were great news, but for the Eastern Bay of Plenty, the thing was the service that replaced the Taneatua Express terminated in Te Puke. The mechanical problems had dissuaded NZR from ordering the planned second batch of 15 railcars, and without them, they could not operate a larger network. One aggrieved resident wrote to the New Zealand Herald to point out that the Bay of Plenty extends beyond Te Puke. But Mick Muin, the Minister of Railways under Walter Nash's short-lived Labour government, was unmoved. Labour had entered power to discover a balance of payments crisis and was not eager to order new rolling stock with foreign currency. No regular passenger train has operated to the Eastern Bay since 1959. Another reason Muin did not budge on operating railcars beyond Te Puke is because the NZR road services offered good connections to the Eastern Bay. Now, some of you have probably been waiting for me to get to the road services. Others, especially younger members of the audience, might think New Zealand Railways road services is a contradiction in terms. If I can introduce the road services in a sentence, it is this. NZR spent over 6 decades shifting passengers from rail to road and then hocked off its buses to a private operator and found itself with almost no long-distance passengers. Now, road competition had become a serious problem for NZR in the mid-1920s. So it had established bus operations in the Hutt Valley, Hawke's Bay and North Otago, and expanded this fleet rapidly throughout the country in the 1930s. Some of these routes were good ideas. They extended NZR's offerings to regions without rail, such as the far north and East Cape. A few replaced mixed trains, for which road was genuinely a better option in sparsely settled rural areas. But many of these bus routes competed with viable passenger trains. Buses were allegedly more modern. The most lucrative travellers were casual ones, not regulars on season passes or student discounts. And some senior officials from the 1930s believed that the only way to stop these casual passengers switching to private buses was for NZR to run its own buses rather than improve its passenger trains. Once these lucrative travellers were on NZR's buses, the trains that mainly carried workers and school children became unprofitable. Subsidies, for instance, did not cover the full cost of the discounted student fares. So NZR was quite happy to cancel passenger trains that relied on school children. Now, many passengers were really unhappy about this. I can assemble quotes from throughout the country questioning the rationale of NZR's decisions and its motives. Now, let's take an example from not far south of here. The Waikato's first train cancelled in favour of buses, which was from Hamilton to Cambridge. Locals had pressed for their mixed trains to be upgraded with rail cars, but NZR never took seriously that there might be a commuter market from Cambridge to Hamilton. A businessman in 1944, aggrieved by the sluggish and unreliable trains, protested to the Waikato Independent that Cambridge was not, quote, a backwater town at the end of the line, and it doesn't matter what time trains arrive here or depart. NZR was not sympathetic because removing passenger accommodation from each train to Cambridge meant it could carry 50 more tonnes of goods. Accusations that NZR prioritised goods over people were undeniably true. And so those passenger trains to Cambridge ended in 1946. So the 1940s and 50s saw the end of most of these rural branch line passenger trains, and the situation started looking bad for intercity services and suburban ones in the 1960s. Insofar as suburban services go, urban planning from the 1950s in Auckland had switched to the motor car, and as far as long distance services from here go, the only secure route from Auckland was the one to Wellington. The twisty line to the Bay of Plenty was struggling to attract patronage in the face of road services buses that ran direct from Auckland. They could go across the Hauraki Plains rather than having to dogleg down to Hamilton and then back up to Pairo. Domestic air travel too was starting to eat into NZR's long distance traffic. But the biggest problem was the Fiats themselves. And their mechanical flaws led to some of the most dramatic cuts to passenger services in 1967. Now, as far as the public knew, these flaws had been fixed. The Fiats ran reliably in the early 60s, providing the enhanced service that NZR had promised. But in 1966, less than 10 years after the last Fiats entered service, their motors were at the end of their working life. Keith Hollyoak's national government didn't consider options for replacement until it was too late to avoid some cancellations, and Treasury would not have a bar of fitting new motors or buying new rail cars. Its bureaucrats were increasingly hostile to rail, as long-distance passenger trains in aggregate were no longer profitable. Some routes made money, but in total, they lost $500,000 a year in the late 60s. Perceptive observers noted that this happened because NZR competed with itself, operating parallel road and rail services. But those critics didn't hold high ministerial roles. Moreover, NZR ignored the advice of Royal Commissioners in 1952, who observed that although goods provided most of NZR's revenue, passenger services were effectively its shop window. Poor passenger trains led to a loss of goods customers and reduced the popular constituency for railway investment. In today's language, it might have been dubbed passenger trains as loss leaders, even those, although many were still profitable, and others would have been if senior management had been less fatalistic and maintained them to a standard that met public expectations. So, As it was, Peter Gordon, Hollyoaks Minister of Railways, secured a compromise to purchase parts for the Fiats, extending their lifespan for a few years. This was not enough to save most of Auckland's rail cars. Some of the most well-developed road services ran from Auckland into Northland, Waikato and the Bay of Plenty. Railcar services to those regions were therefore some of the first to end. First to go was the service to Whangarei and Ōkaihau in July 1967, its patronage having fallen sharply after the Auckland Harbour Bridge opened in 1959. Not even a petition signed by over 11,000 people could reverse that decision. The railcar to Te Puke followed in September 1967. Travellers vented their anger at the government and railway administrators. One Auckland letter writer suggested the characterisation of these routes as uneconomic was an attempt to cover up government policy blunders. Another asked if the Railways Department is more concerned with the profit on goods cartage than with passenger needs. The only possible answer is yes. Now, the Rotorua service soldiered on until November 1968. And honestly, it is hard to fathom the cancellation of this railcar, because Rotorua then, as now, was a premier tourist destination. And just a decade ago, the chief mechanical engineer had suggested introducing premium European trains for this route, and junior NZR officers confirmed traveller interest in improved railway services. Instead, Peter Gordon boasted that the new bus service ran faster than the Fiats. Not only a sad boast from a Minister of Railways, but also inane when railways received increasing funds while not a cent was made available to improve the difficult railway route over the Mamaku Range. Now, NZR did attempt one new railcar service from Auckland in the late 60s. It accepted a proposal from the Hamilton City Council to inaugurate a fast service from Auckland to Hamilton, refurbishing one of the most mechanically sound Fiats into the Blue Streak, named for its distinctive paint job seen on this slide. It began operation in April 1968. Patronage didn't actually meet expectations on the Hamilton run because of poor timetabling decisions. But in September 1968, it was shifted to a daytime service between Auckland and Wellington, and that proved so successful that NZR bought 3 new Japanese rail cars in 1972, known as Silver Ferns, to run that service. Unlike the Fiats, they proved reliable. They ran the service between Auckland and Wellington until 1991 and performed other duties right up until 2019. However, incremental decline was continuing elsewhere. NZR was pursuing a policy of managed decline for its urban passenger services, except in Wellington. That is, it operated trains until they broke, then didn't replace them, and let the deteriorating quality dissuade patronage so that cancellations appeared financially sensible. So that's what was going on in Auckland with the pivot to building motorways in the 1960s. And Christchurch, similarly, it lost its last commuter train in 1976. Dunedin followed in 1982, and Auckland's network was on the brink. Official reports in the 1980s advocated shutting down Auckland's commuter rail entirely, arguing that even doubling rail patronage would have negligible effects on gridlock or the environment. But in the early 90s, Auckland got lucky. First with rail managers who backed rail's potential, then even luckier when it could buy 19 cheap diesel multiple units from Perth, which had electrified its network. These trains, some of which were near new, were a huge improvement on the decrepit carriages that had rattled around suburban Auckland. Again, even a modest improvement showed that New Zealanders would travel by train if they were provided with a service worth using and not treated contemptuously. Auckland's rail revival has exceeded the expectations of even the strongest advocates, surging from scarcely 1 million annual passenger journeys in the early 90s to 10 million in 2011 and 20 million in 2016. It barely needs saying that if all the commuters in Auckland who travel by train today switch to cars tomorrow, the city would melt down. There also appeared to be a new dawn for long-distance passenger rail in the late 1980s. NZR was operating in new ways after a series of institutional reforms. These began under Rob Muldoon's national government, which corporatised the Railways Department in 1982, and then Roger Douglas and Richard Prebble went much further as Ministers of Finance and Railways in David Lange's Labour government. A new passenger business group sold off the road services buses to the Intercity Consortium, thus divesting itself of the passengers it had so vigorously shifted from rail to road. But it also rebranded, reinvigorated, and in two cases reintroduced trains to lure back some of the passengers it had told for decades to stop considering rail. The new trains were the Geyserland Express to Rotorua and the Kaimai Express to Tauranga, the latter taking its name from the Kaimai Tunnel, a new and quicker route under the Kaimai Range that had opened for goods trains in 1978. So this is what the Silver Ferns switched to, as depicted on one of my favourite New Zealand stamps down here at bottom left. So having that new tunnel through the Kaimai Range was great. It made timings competitive. But the situation for the Geyserland Express to Rotorua was less positive, because in 1988, NZR abandoned its central railway station in favour of a goods yard in the northern suburb Kautu. The Rotorua Central Morgue sits on the old station site. The Geyserland Express instead, holidaymakers found themselves disembarking onto a temporary platform in an industrial precinct, and plans to either restore the line almost all the way into the centre of town or to build a proper station at Kautu never materialised. So nonetheless, 2 trains a day ran from Auckland to Rotorua, as well as one to Tauranga, and other rebranded services around the country did well. The Christchurch to Greymouth train, so decrepit in 1983 that external consultants recommended it be replaced with a bus, instead it became the world-famous Transalpine. While the Christchurch to Picton train, which came so close to cancellation in 1976 that for a month it existed only as a carriage attached to an overnight express goods train, instead found success in the late 80s as the Coastal Pacific. But unfortunately, this was a false dawn. Privatisation did not treat passenger rail well. Jim Bolger's national government continued Roger Douglas's policies by selling NZR in 1993. It rebranded as Transrail in 1995, with the long-distance trains operated under the Transcenic brand. High-profile accidents, however, fostered public scepticism of safety under the new privatised regime. Transrail became a notorious asset stripper, not at all inclined to upgrade track. Roads got better, while railways remained in 1930s condition, or even went backwards. And Transcenic's marketing left a lot to be desired. Some tourist offerings won awards, but the focus on leisure travellers became a fixation. Holidaymakers are much less time or price sensitive than other groups. Business travellers weren't inclined to catch slow passenger trains. Fare increases priced out families, the elimination of many stops deterred local travellers, and timetables for tourists were unsuited to commuters or shoppers. A damning indictment of Transrail is that passenger numbers declined despite the parlous state of domestic airlines. Ansett went into liquidation in April 2001, while Helen Clark's Labour government stepped in to save Air New Zealand. If Transrail had upgraded routes and quickened timetables, if it had provided a service that appealed to a wider clientele, and most importantly, if it had marketed its products effectively and fostered a more positive public image, long-distance passenger rail might have entered the new millennium in good health. Instead, Transrail executives deemed passenger services not central to their core business and put them up for sale in October 2000. It was a culmination of over 70 years of viewing passengers as inflexible, demanding people who get in the way of goods. 5 of TransScenic's 9 trains did not find a buyer. 3 services from Auckland, the Geyserland and Kaimai Expresses and the Waikato Connection, all ceased on the 7th of October 2001. Transrail's leadership was so dismissive of passengers that its managing director, Michael Beard, said with a straight face that commuters who use the 6:15 a.m. Waikato Connection from Hamilton to Auckland could switch to the Northerner, which left Hamilton at 4:54 a.m. So, as well as the demise of these 3 trains from Auckland, the Bay Express from Wellington to Napier also perished on the 7th of October 2001, and the Southerner from Christchurch to Dunedin and Invercargill followed on the 10th of February 2002. So those dates in 2001 and 2002 should live in infamy, for they represent the end of modal choice, accessibility and efficiency and sustainability throughout New Zealand's regions. It is genuinely incomprehensible that the Southerner perished, because in its dying days, with old locomotives and decaying carriages, it ran a timetable from Christchurch to Oamaru that even today a non-stop drive can only just match. And yet the cuts kept coming. The overnight Northerner between Auckland and Wellington ended in 2004 after almost a century of night trains connecting New Zealand's largest city with its capital. The daytime Overlander nearly met the same fate 2 years later, but in the end, Toll, who had taken over the network from Transrail, it blinked and the train stayed. In fact, it surged in popularity to 2010 with renewed promotion, but today it's been rebranded as the Northern Explorer, and I would suggest that further blunders and an obsessive focus on tourists mean that it's been suspended since COVID hit, and when it returns, tickets will cost more than the average airfare, despite taking 11 hours to complete the journey, a timing that would have seemed archaic 50 years ago. Oh, there's my favorite transition. That's a good one. So that vortex perhaps raises the question, are passenger trains about to swirl into obscurity, or is there a future for them? The past century is a story of decline, but this, as I hope I've made clear, was not inevitable. Politicians made choices not to invest in rail, backed heavily from the 60s by a Treasury Department whose dismissal of rail often veered into contempt. Senior officials from NZR and its successors, moreover, prioritised goods over passengers, presided over policies of managed decline, and abandoned numerous markets. Yet I think there are reasons to believe that we have reached the nadir and that from here passenger rail will expand. Last year, the twice-daily Te Huia revived commuter services between Hamilton and Auckland. It is frankly absurd that these growing, interconnected cities do not enjoy a passenger timetable at least as good as that between Wellington and the country towns of the Wairarapa. Comparable Australian cities have even more frequent services, and you know things are bad when your rail services compare badly with the underfunded railway mess of Australia. New Zealand's car dependency emerged from a succession of conscious decisions, and we can unmake them. Rapidly too, if we try. In this time of acute concern about climate change and local councils declaring climate emergencies, passenger rail is essential for a sustainable future. No mode of transport can match the energy efficiency of steel wheels on steel rails. Younger people look to the railway corridors that thread their ways through the New Zealand and wonder what use can be made of them. Why do they carry our goods but not us? Why do we depend on cars rather than developing integrated multimodal transport that is accessible for all and provides choices? So the public transport advocates at Greater Auckland have proposed this regional rail network that would link Auckland, Hamilton, Rotorua and Tauranga. And it comes in 3 stages, turning a seemingly pie-in-the-sky idea into something realistic and achievable. And this is just one of the many plans floating around. All good plans create pipelines with staged development. We need to regain the institutional capacity and expertise to deliver large public works. This capacity, this institutional capacity, has been lost since the 1980s, which has led to public works projects in New Zealand having outlandishly high costs and long timeframes. A newly announced program to upgrade Wellington's commuter network, for instance, has a 30-year timeframe to do what could have once been done in 5. Other plans, such as putting Auckland's proposed light rail underground, reflect outdated transport planning mindsets that focus on not inconveniencing cars. We must plan for all the modes, and we must communicate clearly to people who do have to drive that taking some road space for trams, bikes and pedestrians means that the reduction in congestion will make life easier for drivers as well. For decades, transport funding has skewed so strongly to road that the rail network falls short of 1930s standards. Imagine if our roads compared unfavourably with the 1930s. It would be a scandal. I'd like to thank Darren Davis and Lewis Holden for bringing my attention to 2 facts. Since 2010, New Zealand has spent over $1.8 billion on the Waikato Expressway, while by comparison, consultants last year estimated it would cost $1.5 billion to electrify the North Island main trunk and the Wairarapa line to Masterton and the East Coast main trunk to Tauranga and buy new electric trains for them. Motorway expenditure is waved through, yet any effort to spend any money on rail, even if it would serve vastly more communities, be more sustainable and accessible, and provide people with choice, is hotly contested, and the political will is not yet there. And at times I fear New Zealand is consigned to a belief that better things are not possible, or if they are, that they can only be achieved incrementally. This mindset is beneath us. We need to undo decades of neglect, not because trains are cool, though they are, but because we need to, for our communities and for our environment. Transport is not just one mode, roads. Time is up for car dependency, and the sooner we make large strides towards nationwide passenger rail revival, the better our future will be. Thank you.